In the shop, you need to be responsible for protecting yourself. Safety glasses and hearing protection should be worn at all times. Eyeglasses are not safety glasses. Goggles or full-face shields work over your eyeglasses. Long sleeves, long hair, dangling clothes, or jewelry need to be removed or safely secured when working. Refer to equipment manuals to understand the features and use of the equipment, but never use any equipment without your instructor's prior approval. Listen to and follow all directions from your instructor, even when they conflict with what you see here. The instructor is there to guide you and keep you safe. If you are uncomfortable making a cut, do not do it. Use a jig, build a fixture, find another method. Your best protection is you. If you want to build beautiful and useful items out of wood that'll last for generations, the first step you need to learn is the proper processing of your stock. Stock that comes from the sawmill may be extremely rough, a little bit rough, like the cedar, or if you buy from a lumber yard or a home center, you may even get stock that's already planed and jointed. But in any case, they all need to be checked, squared, and prepared properly to ensure that they fit the way you want and that they won't move or twist or warp over time. Since your board is rough as it comes from the mill and the sides aren't square or straight, we can't count on anything from this board. So the first step is we need to flatten one face until it's smooth and completely flat from end to end, and then that becomes the reference face, which we can use to then square the sides, make the top parallel to the flattened bottom, and plane to thickness, and then rip to final width and cut to final length. So let's look at this process step by step. How you treat your lumber from the moment it arrives at your shop is important to the entire process. Wood is a natural material. It expands and contracts, both with temperature and with changes in humidity. We have to account for this in our build process, but we also have to account for this in our preparation process. Step one is to make sure that the lumber acclimates to your shop, especially in summer or winter when the humidity and temperature are at extremes. This is important. I bring my lumber in and I stack it with these little sticks called stickers in between each layer. They're just pieces of scrap that I've cut up, and they allow the air to pass between all the layers of my stock, allowing it to change temperature more quickly, to lose or absorb moisture, to balance out with the atmosphere that it's stored in. Side by side, the pieces are not stacked tight together. I leave a little bit of a gap there as well to allow as much airflow as possible around the stack. Remember that lumber yards often stack their material outdoors, or if not completely uncovered, there may be a roof over it, but the open air is still allowed to get to it. The surface of your boards may be wet if it rained recently when they come in. The moisture content in the summertime may be too high, or in the wintertime may be too low. You need to allow this stock to balance out and reach that optimal temperature and moisture level before you start processing it. Otherwise, once you're done processing, the wood is then going to change and acclimate to your shop, and it's going to force you to redo that entire process. So make sure that you've got your stack properly stored when you bring your lumber in, and in an ideal world, you want to give it at least a week to acclimate to the temperature and the moisture in your shop before you start processing. Face jointing, or creating that reference surface, is the first step to prepping our parts. But the very first task is to decide which of the two faces we're going to joint. And that's determined by whether or not there's a bow in the board. In this case, as we look at the board, we can see that there's a bow, a little cup right here, and you can see that on the table right here. If we were to try and joint the other face, where the bow is outward, then the piece can rock on the table. It won't stay steady as we try to face joint it, and we won't be able to properly smooth it. With the cup upward, whether it's on one end or in the middle or on the other end, with the cup upward, then the ends are riding on the jointer surface, maintaining balance and stability as we remove material from the two ends, working into the center, and we'll be done face jointing when we have one smooth face all the way across. And it's not just rough lumber that we have to be worried about this with. Here I've got a piece of aspen picked up at my home center in an 8-foot length, and I've already cross-cut it to the size I want for the next process. But there is a very slight bow in this piece right there in the middle. And I can prove that by setting it upside down, and you can see the end here rocking. As I push on one end, the other end is rocking. This way, that doesn't happen. So even boards that you buy already processed, already face and edge jointed, may yet need to be treated before you can use them, because this board is not straight. And so if I were to use it for a shelf or an overhanging piece, there's nothing to hold it in a straight configuration. This piece still needs to be face jointed and planed to smooth. Now that we know which face we're going to joint, we need to know which direction we're going to pass the wood across the jointer. And this is determined by grain direction. In this close-up of the jointer, you can see the orientation of the jointer head and the wood. We want to pass the board across the jointer so that the grain is falling down and to the rear. This ensures that any tear out actually happens where the jointer hasn't yet cut, and it will be removed as we joint our board. With rough lumber, you may not be able to see at a glance which way the grain is oriented. A quick pass over the jointer or a few licks with a hand plane will expose the grain and let you choose. When jointing, using the proper technique is critical to getting excellent results. It starts with the board being held firmly on the infeed table as you lead into the cutter. But as soon as possible, you want to transfer the force to the outfeed table so that the section you just smoothed is riding on the outfeed table and helping to reference the rest of the cut. Each pass will remove a little more material from the ends, working toward the center. And while you do have to push down to get the traction to move the board across the jointer, the force should be directed as much as possible against the rear fence rather than the table. You don't want to be pressing the bow out of the board. If you force the center downward, then when you release the force, the board will spring back into its original position. It may be smooth, but it won't be flat. The jointer has to do the work, removing the material from the ends until it reaches the center. Now once I've got my stock face jointed the way I want it, I want to put a mark on this face for two reasons. To mark that this is the face that I've actually jointed, but also the direction that I fed through here will guide me in the direction that I want to feed my part through the planer later. So rather than just making a plain X, I actually make an X with a loop. And the loop tells me that this is the direction that I fed it through the jointer. So even later on, when I'm working with my stock, this corresponds to the grain direction that I chose earlier. It's the right way to go through, and I know that I need to put this backwards through the planer later. The other issue to keep in mind as you're face jointing is to choose your straightest stock for your longest pieces. This part has a pretty significant bow in the center. The lines that I've drawn on it show how much material would need to be removed in order to get the board flat. Choosing a flatter piece for this longer stock means I have to remove less material. But this doesn't mean that the first part we looked at can't be used. It can be cross-cut for some shorter pieces that we may need for our project. Shorter parts will require less jointing to make them flat and smooth. With a reference face to work from, the opposite face can be planed parallel. The cutter head for the planer is on top rather than below as with the jointer. So our reference face is put on the bed of the planer, with our grain direction marks from previously going backwards, so the grain is presented to the cutter head up and to the back. The planer uses a pair of feed rollers on each side of the cutter head to guide the part through. No stock should ever be fed into the planer that is shorter than the distance between the feed rollers. A good rule of thumb is to be at least as long as the bed inside the machine. Initially, the planer height should be set to the thickness of your thickest piece of stock that you're processing, and run all the pieces you're processing at once through the planer at this height. Some may be cut a little bit, some may not touch the cutter at all. Once all the parts have passed through at this setting, then the head can be lowered slightly and all the stock passed through again, maintaining the same travel direction that you started with. Keep repeating this process, lowering the head each time until all of the parts are being planed all the way across the top surface. At this point, both faces of all your stock are parallel and all of the stock is the same thickness. But it might not be the thickness that you need to end up with. We use a slightly different strategy to plane all of the clean stock down to the final dimension. You're still going to lower the height of the head slightly each time the entire batch has been planed. But once both faces are flat, we want to start removing material from both faces evenly to help keep the stresses in the wood balanced by not removing too much material from one face. So each board is flipped end for end each time it goes through the planer. And you need to be keeping an eye on the thickness of the stock after it's been run through the planer until you get to the dimension that you're planing to. Now we have a board or a stack of boards with two clean, smooth, parallel faces, and they should be thickness to the size that we want them to end up at. So now we need to clean up one of the two edges so that we can go to the table saw and rip this piece to final width. Again, we're going to come to the jointer. We're going to joint off the smoother of the two edges, but again, we want to be looking for which edge is concave or convex. So this is the edge that I want to joint, because again, I want the two ends to be in contact with the jointer as I remove material. It looks like the grain is going mostly this way, so that's the way I want to pass it across my jointer, just as before, down into the back so that the cutter head is removing material and any tear out gets removed after the fact. Now right here around where the knot is, the grain actually changes direction. Nothing we can do about that, but once we have a straight edge, then we can rip this edge and maybe re-rip if we have to, but the predominant grain direction tells us that we want to feed this way. Now if this grain direction were going in the other way, then I could reverse the part and feed it through with the opposite face. I still always want my grain direction going down into the back. So the reason for planing both of these faces beforehand is so that either one of them can reference off of the fence of the jointer, allowing me to properly control my grain direction. Now as we feed, the fence is 90 degrees to the table, and we're going to hold our part tight to the table as we guide it through in order to not only straighten this edge, but also to make sure that it's square to the faces of our part. We want everything to be square and straight and referenced properly off each other. got a little bit of a defect here, and you can see that it shows I can either joint that all the way out, or if this board's going to get some kind of other processing, it may not have to, but I have a generally good edge here to work from now. I can safely rip this piece on the table saw. Now with our boards properly flat, parallel, and square, we can rip them to the proper width for our project. Now I'm ready to cross-cut my stock to length. I've put a cross-cut blade in my table saw. I've got my miter gauge set to the length I want to cut the pieces to the final length. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim one edge first, just taking a little bit off just to make sure that it's square to everything else. And then I can flip the part over and remove the rest to the length that my flip stop is set to. This allows me the ability to cut away. I can choose which end I want to start from and cut away anything that I don't like on one end or the other. Now here I have 5 parts. They're all rectangular, all the faces are square, all the corners, everything is exactly what I need. These can become any part of my project that I need them to from here on out. I can make them individual parts, I can glue them together into panels, whatever I need to do with them, these parts are properly prepped and ready to go on to the next step of my project. Here's a pro tip. When I'm concerned about wood movement issues in the project that I'm building, I will mill the stock twice. Go through and mill everything out exactly the way we just discussed in this video. Face jointing, edge jointing, the whole thing. But stop and leave your stock a little bit oversized. Leave it about a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch too thick, maybe a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch too wide, and at least an inch oversized in length. Then sticker and stack your parts, just like we talked about, allowing airflow in between the parts, and let them relax out. Remember I talked earlier about planing for thickness and flipping your pieces end for end every time they go through the planer. This removes an equal amount of material from both sides, keeping the stresses inside the wood in balance. Well, anytime you remove a lot of material from a piece of lumber, you're going to be releasing those stresses. This process of pre-milling and then allowing them to sit for several days, up to a week, allows that wood to relax again. You will notice when you go to process them that there will be slight bows and warps and twists. So at this point, we will start right from the beginning again. Face jointing, edge jointing, planing for thickness, the whole thing all over again. It is a little more time consuming, but the end result is a project where the wood will not move in unexpected ways. It will always move slightly with changes in temperature and humidity as the seasons change, but it's predictable and you can design around it. I've got projects that I built decades ago. The joints are tight still, the pieces haven't cracked, nothing's moved in an unpredictable way. And this process will allow you to accomplish that 9 out of 10 times.